So we have our guest here today, and our wonderful guest, independent journalist Eva Bartlett.
Hi.
Hi, thank you for being here.
Oh, my pleasure.
You've been doing some amazing on the ground coverage and of the whole situation, going into these areas where a lot of journalists don't dare to go, putting your life on the line. And I wanted to have people that are on the ground to come on and talk about this, and specifically have had also great things to say about really what is happening, because it's so difficult to actually have any truth, to find the truth. And when you tell people in the Western world, especially in the United States right now, they look at you like you're insane. So thankful for the coverage. And I really just wanted to start off by discussing something that I think more journalists should be discussing, specifically because it like with Julian Assange, that affects us all. And when somebody like you that's doing such important work is put on a kill list, I think that more people should be discussing how insane that is. And so I just wanted you to tell us a little bit more about that Ukraine put you on a kill list.
Yeah, and I will preface it by saying, of course, I'm not the only person. There are thousands, if not many, many more thousands of people, not only journalists, including Ukrainian journalists, but Ukrainian opposition members, normal civilians, people who've done something as seemingly harmless as driving a pensioner from the DPR to wherever they need to go to pick up their pension. So for that crime, being put on what is effectively a kill list. And I know the naysayers will say, well, how can you say this is a kill list? Well, what Ukraine does, or the people behind this site, which, the President Zelensky is very aware of the site, and I'm paraphrasing, but he essentially said, he doesn't, because there was a movement, I think in 2015, a person trying to get it taken down, and he effectively just said, well, no, it's not our place to interfere in media. Ironically, because that's the whole principle of this site, is to quash any sort of dissent and silence any sort of dissenting media. But what was I going to say? I had a point I was just going to make, but anyway, what I was thinking earlier was just imagine if this kill list were, for example, Syrian or Russian. And one of the things that the apologist for this kill list will say, they'll say, you entered Ukraine illegally. Well, that's debatable, because the republics of the Donbass and Crimea are not a part of Ukraine any longer. They declared themselves autonomous. Crimea voted to return to Russia, as Crimeans told me when I went there in 2019. So this whole notion that I have illegally entered Ukraine is ridiculous, but let's just assume even that it has any merit in reality. We have seen for years journalists entering Syria illegally via Turkey, embedding with Al-Qaeda, embedding with ISIS, embedding with all the terrorist factions in Syria. Now, imagine that the Syrian government or somebody in line with the Syrian government implemented such a kill list. Imagine what kind of outcry you would have from the various, bodies to protect journalists, representatives of Western governments, the media, etc. But because it is Ukraine that has done this with the complicity of the West, there is no outcry. Now, on the note of myself personally, being on that kill list, just recently, CBC journalist has been reaching out to me. Now, CBC, as you know, is Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, Canada's state-funded media, notorious war propagandist, not to be trusted on anything, perhaps not even the weather. And I'm very familiar by now, 2022, of how the media operates and how they reach out to journalists in a very polite tone to try to entrap them into an interview in which they will take, as they did with a Canadian colleague based in China, 3 seconds of a 20 or so minute interview in order to distort their words and cherry pick them and depict the person being targeted as whatever, the slander is. That's what CBC intends to do with me. I refuse to participate. I refuse to validate them as an objective and realistic media. They are completely a propagandistic platform. But the point to be made about this particular journalist reaching out to me is that he did not reach out to me about the kill list, which has gotten a lot of publicity over the years, and particularly of late, I've been speaking out about it. He reached out to me about my participation in a tribunal in Moscow, tribunal on Ukraine's war crimes.
Mm-hmm.
My participation was my observations having visited the Donbass. At that point, it was 2 times, and now it's been 3 times. And I was giving my observations on what I saw and heard from civilians in the Donbass. That was my participation. And that's one of the reasons I'm currently listed on Ukraine's kill list. And so this journalist, he could not have known about my participation in this tribunal, to my knowledge, because I did not advertise it. So if he's following my social media, I didn't put it anywhere in my social media, mainly because I didn't have a link and I got busy. But if he's aware of the kill list and the entry on me, then he would be aware of my participation in this tribunal because the kill list specifies that. So the thing is, he's reached out to me in a condescendingly polite tone, wanting to interview me, but he doesn't want to interview me about the fact that a fellow Canadian journalist is on a kill list. And I think the point I was trying to make before that I kind of had a lapse of thought is that people whose names and personal information have been put on that kill list have been killed. And this is the thing, they put as much information, including home address, phone number, etc., on that list, and they call for the people to be liquidated. I mean, you can argue whether this is a kill list or not, but the fact is people have died as a result of being listed there. So this journalist representing CBC, who I don't think is acting on his own accord, I think he's acting on behalf of the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, is not interested in discussing the fact that I am on a kill list, which could see me disappeared. He wants to discuss and distort my participation in a tribunal on Ukraine's war crimes. And I foresee that whatever garbage they come out with, the CBC, will be to taint me as an apologist for alleged crimes they attribute to Russia. And they will not talk at all about Ukraine's 8 years of war on the people of the Donbass and their manifold war crimes, or any of that, much less the kill list.
Yeah, and just one more thing. I just wanted to ask you, has any other journalist beside the CBC journalist reached out and asked you to interview you about what's like the threats you've received or the fact that you are on this kill list from Canada? Has any other journalist actually cared to ask you, hey, are you okay? We need to talk about this?
Yeah, 2 journalists with Maverick Media, independent media, reached out to me. Actually, and that's the thing. I think that's how. I think that's another means that the CBC became aware of the fact that I'm on the kill list. They interviewed me at length. It was almost a 2-hour interview, and they gave me freedom to speak, unlike the CBC would, about not only about the fact that I'm on this kill list, about, again, citing at length an article I wrote about it some years ago, because I wasn't placed on it recently. It's just recently gotten more notice, but also enabling me to speak about what I've seen in the Donbass on my trips there. And again, the civilians that have been bombarded by Ukraine in violation of the Minsk Accords with heavy weapons. And these journalists were very concerned about my well-being. Now, I've spent a lot of time in war zones. I've come under Israeli fire on more times than I could possibly list in my time in Gaza, and being in Syria and close proximity to Al Qaeda and other terrorist groups, you get accustomed to the danger and the risk of doing that sort of journalism. So I make that point to say, it's not going to intimidate me from doing journalism, but in principle, a journalist should be concerned when a fellow journalist is put on a kill list. And so I am grateful to these 2 Canadian journalists of Maverick Media for reaching out to me. And they said that they would try to alert other Canadian media and, do their best to speak to Canadian authorities about this. And I'm very grateful to them for that. I have to say, cynical because I'm well aware of Canada's stance with regards to Ukraine. Canada's at least $1 billion of funding to Ukraine, which includes arming Ukraine, which includes arming the Nazi battalions within Ukraine. And the very real and widespread, as I understand, ultra-nationalist Ukrainian population within Canada itself, and the fact that our Deputy Prime Minister, Chrystia Freeland, is not only a proud descendant of a Nazi collaborator, but she herself is very active in Ukraine, very active within the nationalist, to put it politely, the extremist Ukrainian community in Canada.
What do you think about the breaking point, though, at this point, Eva? Because it's like, I remember when it came to the Azov Battalion, BBC did a little piece years before this whole controversy got started. I think there's a lot of people now, if you just kind of judge on, when you look at the Twitter bots or, who they're pushing back against, they're pushing back against people who've kind of come to light about when it comes to the Azov Battalion and who we're funding. How do you think it is in Canada? I mean, shouldn't they be either further along the line, especially since this kind of like Nazism is just right in their face?
You would think so, but and now I'm not the most well versed, and I intend to change that. But I'm not the most well versed on Canada's history of supporting Nazis and bringing them to Canada, and encouraging the continuation of the Nazi ideology, which Canada has done. But there are still monuments to Nazis in Canada, and
Really?
Whereas in this woke age of tearing down historical monuments to Nazis go untouched in Canada. I think there's some excellent journalists that revealed in great depth Chrystia Freeland's Nazi ancestry, and the fact that it isn't just a case of her being a descendant of somebody who had those values or lack thereof, but the fact that she herself holds them. I'm trying to remember their name. They're based in Alberta. They've done excellent research, but unfortunately, you would expect based on Canada's reputation as being this peaceful nation, you would expect that this would be abhorrent and repellent, and particularly given that the Zionist lobby in Canada is so strong. So anytime anyone launches any sort of very valid criticism about Israel and its endless acts of terrorism against the Palestinian people, you get labeled anti-Semitic and this and that. You would expect, that the same Zionist lobby would be outspoken over the fact that there are still statues memorializing Nazis in Canada, but no, it's pretty upside down world in Canada.
You were interviewing several people on the ground for weeks. I mean, and we're interacting with other journalists. Tell us about what you saw in terms of the Russian treatment of civilians, because as you know, all you hear in the States is how Russians are killing Ukrainians en masse, how they're the ones bombing schools, hospitals. We know a lot of this, of course, has been debunked, thankfully for alternative media and other journalists like yourself. But tell us about what you specifically saw on the ground.
Well, and I will preface that by saying, bear in mind that I was in the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. So I was not in Ukraine. I have been in Ukraine, but because I'm on a kill list, obviously I can't go there. So what I'm talking about is what I've seen in the Donbass republics.
Perfect.
And also keep in mind that the majority, if not the overwhelming majority of people in those republics identify as Russian and ethnic Russian. So it doesn't make sense that Russia, which is aiding the Donbass forces in reclaiming areas that were held by Ukraine, it doesn't make sense that Russian forces would be abusing the people there, because they are allies, right? And so that's kind of one major hole with the Western reports on alleged atrocities by Russian forces against the people in the areas they've reclaimed or helped the Donbass forces reclaim. But what I saw was, I have to say, similar to what I've seen in Syria. in that when an area is restored or when terrorists are extracted from an area. So in Syria, these were Al Qaeda, Ahrar Sham, Jaish al-Islam, all the other alphabet soup of terrorists. And in the Donbass, these are the Ukrainian forces and the Nazi battalions with them. When they are removed from an area, then efforts to restabilize the area begin right away. And so you see, immense food aid deliveries coming into these areas. It's of course nothing happens 100% perfectly and quickly, but what I saw was people forming orderly lines, waiting for their turn to go up and receive food aid, and a generous amount of food aid being distributed. I know from fellow colleagues who've had the chance, for example, to return to areas where they saw, for example, the city of Volnovakha. I've been there just the one time, but I have colleagues that have been there a couple of times. So they were there shortly after it was liberated, which I think, if I remember correctly, was in early March. And then they went back there 2 or 3 weeks afterwards. And they were saying, already the progress that they saw in the space of 2 or 3 weeks was pretty considerable, considering that while these areas have been liberated, there are still fights in other areas to continue liberating areas. So, in spite of the fact that resources are stretched throughout the Donbass republics, in liberated areas, the rebuilding, maybe not rebuilding, but restoration of stability process is pretty quick. And what else have I seen? I have to be very clear. I don't speak Russian, whereas when I'm in Syria, I can speak Arabic, but I don't speak Russian. So I am relying on translators, and whether in live or later on. But what I've seen from being with people who speak Russian and or later having my videos translated is, again, and you'll see this from, if people are following a variety of different Telegram channels, you'll see over and over again people thanking the Russian forces for coming, or the Russian and the Donbass forces for coming, and also very, very clearly blaming the Ukrainian forces for occupying residential areas, for occupying infrastructure like schools and hospitals, and not only occupying, but of course militarizing them. This is precisely what terrorist groups did in Syria, precisely the same playbook. In fact, I keep saying, and I'm not the only one, of course, that everything we're seeing playing out with regards to how Russia and the Donbass forces are advancing, with regards to how the Ukrainian forces use civilians as human shields, and with regards to how the media is portraying things, it's the same as we saw in Syria, the exact same. All the fabricated stories, the hoaxes, and in the cases where there have been hospitals or schools damaged by liberating forces, it has been precisely because they have been occupied, militarized, and in many cases mined by Ukrainian forces. And that is something, when I went to Volnovakha, there was the chief physician of the main hospital there. He specifically told a group of journalists I was there with in March, he specifically said there were Ukrainian forces in the hospital, and before they retreated from the hospital, they mined the intensive care unit. So he said that very clearly, and the 2 French mainstream media outlets that were with us completely omitted that. They cherry-picked, as the CBC intended to do with me, they cherry-picked 2 seconds of him saying something that wasn't very clear. And they basically said, we don't know why there's this destruction, but it's for sure Russia's fault. And that's also the same playbook as we saw in Syria. I mean, I remember in 2014, Lise Doucet of the CBC was present in Damascus when I was there for my first time in April 2014. And an elementary school in the old city was shelled by terrorists in eastern Ghouta. And her later report was to say, well, it's not known who's doing the shelling. It could be the regime. And of course, that was not the truth. Anybody who was living there knew exactly where those shells were coming from on a daily basis, and it was from eastern Ghouta. So we're seeing the same war propaganda tactics, the same tactics by the Ukrainian forces of occupying civilian and hospital and school infrastructure. Mm-hmm. And we're also seeing people ask, like, why is it taking so long for Russia and the Donbass forces to liberate areas? Because now, if you're paying attention to media from Donetsk, for example, you'll see an increase, a dramatic increase of Ukrainian forces shelling the city and it's gotten incredibly brutal of late. I mean, it's been bad the last 8 years, but it's really increased. And so people are saying, why is this happening? Why isn't Russia taking them out? Why aren't the Donbass forces taking them out? Well, from my understanding, there's a couple of reasons. One is that they're well entrenched, and I would highly recommend people to follow Brian Berlatek. He has a military background, and he in fact, I was just listening to one of his videos before we started, and he was describing how Ukraine has had 8 years to well and deeply entrench themselves around the Donbass, which makes it difficult to remove them. But the other factor is that Russia and the Donbass forces know of these tactics of using civilians as human shields, and they're reluctant to always fire back.
Right.
I think it's also part of the tactic from Ukraine to say, let's make sure we pull the Russians to come further into Western Ukraine, therefore making them look like the aggressors so we can still go forth with our propaganda campaign. But to be honest with you, Eva, I really thought it was going to be a hard sell from the get-go that the mainstream media and the United States government, the Western government, was going to really try to sell this whole situation in Donetsk, trying to make the Russians look like an invading army, especially when if you've done any research to see that region and whatnot, you'd understand these are ethnic speaking Russians and whatnot, who really, love their alignment with Mother Russia. Have you traveled into any areas yet where there might be some kind of like a little conflict where you see a mixture of people who are saying, no, we're still somewhat Ukrainians and the Russians have no business being here? Because it seems like, in addition to making sure that Donetsk is liberated, that there's going to be some areas that the Russian Federation are going to take away from Ukraine for strategic purposes, like cutting them off of the Black Sea. Have you got into any of those little crevices where you've seen a little pushback from the Ukrainian side?
No, I have not. And I'm certainly open to hearing people if they want to, express that opinion. I'm not going to say you can't say that. I'm certainly open to listening to them and sharing their opinion, but I have not been in areas like that. I mean, I do intend on going back if I'm able to reach some of the areas outside of the Donbass that have been recovered or that have been taken. Then I would happily, talk to people, or with the aid of a translator, talk to people. But thus far, I don't have that experience now.
Look, I want to talk a little bit more about the Nazi element because, as you know, they're rebranding themselves with their symbols, and they're doing everything they can here to whitewash the fact that, they'll say, well, it's a minority, but they don't talk about how they're powerful minority. They're the most dangerous. And so what elements of results and consequences on the people of the Donbass region have you seen from the Azov battalion, the ultranationalist, far right, paramilitary, fascist entities that exist?
Well, if I'm speaking of my personal experience, it would be in the Lugansk People's Republic, in a village whose name eludes me at the moment, but it is north and slightly west of Lugansk, and it was the area that had been a former factory was turned by the Aidar battalion into a prison. And both people that were part of the Lugansk defenders of the militia, and also civilians, were kept there in horrendous conditions and were tortured. It's believed some were executed. It's not known how many might have been executed, but certainly torture was done, and it was committed there by the Aidar battalion. And so that's just one incident, but you have, I also recommend Lugansk-based journalist George Eliasson. He lives there. He's been there, I want to say, for a decade, maybe less, maybe more, but he certainly has been there for a while. And he can speak about things like actual mass graves committed, whether by the Nazi battalions or the Ukrainian forces or combined, where there is actually an RT documentary featuring George Eliasson, and he speaks about how bodies found in that mass grave were decapitated, which is, ISIS style things. And actually, even when I was doing a report on the Aidar prison I visited, I found Amnesty International even was able, like, Amnesty is not my go-to for honest reports, but even back in 2014, they said Aidar is guilty of war crimes. And then I think it was Newsweek compared Aidar's actions there to ISIS. So, I mean, that's just one example. But again, if you look at reports from people like Patrick Lancaster, or Russian or Donbass media that have had a lot of time in Mariupol and had a lot of chance to interview people in Mariupol. Or I also highly recommend people like Maxim Grigoriev, who's done excellent work taking testimonies from civilians in Syria prior, in Mariupol and other areas now. And you'll have countless testimonies of people who have direct experience with Aidar and Azov, and can speak at length of the torture they endured under these Nazi battalions. And it is definitely misleading, and it is definitely intellectually dishonest of Western media and talking heads to downplay the effect of these Nazi battalions on the people, not only of the Donbass, but of all of Ukraine.
Yeah. Pasta, did you have a question?
No, go ahead. Next one.
Okay. Well, I wanted to talk a little bit about the well, you've already talked about the similarities. So, you saw in Syria and how this has happened before, but can you give a little bit more of insight into the false flag attempts? Because Russia is always seemed to be ahead of the Ukrainian media, Western-backed, forces in anticipating and saying, "Hey, this is what's going to happen." They're gonna try to frame us and say Russia bombed the school, but really this is what's happening. The false flag attempts, just how much of that have you seen or looked on from other journalists and reports?
I would say most of what I've seen is via other journalists, via Telegram channels. And Russia, I would say, has had, well, I mean, I probably couldn't limit it only to Syria, but even if we just look at Syria, Russia has had, years of attempted false flags in Syria to learn from how terrorists operate in Syria and how their comrades, their brethren in Ukraine would operate. The one that I could personally address was the claim of a mass grave to the west of Mariupol. This is a claim that was cited from, they called him the mayor of Mariupol. He was formerly the mayor of Mariupol. I don't know his whereabouts. According to two men I met at what is actually just a normal cemetery that was dubbed by all of Western media as a mass grave, according to them, the mayor fled early on in Russia's military operation. So he's not even in the vicinity yet. He's cited, just like media cited various unnamed activists or media activists or what have you in Syria for their various hoaxes and false flags. This mayor is cited as a reputable source for his claim, and he actually claimed it was the worst crime of the 21st century, this alleged mass grave to the west of Mariupol. He claimed it was like 30 meters wide, a big pit, and bodies were thrown in, and that Russians were like at night trying to bury the dead, trying to cover their war crimes. And he claimed up to 9,000 bodies were buried there. And what then Western media did was they used like satellite technology. I forget the name of the company, but for an average media consumer, they see what looks like, well, it was a satellite image, although I'm pretty certain they could have zoomed in more and given more clarity to what I saw when I went there. But what you see in the murky satellite images on the Washington Post, et cetera, looks like, oh my goodness, there's all this new activity and it must be a mass grave. But when I went to the area in question, Mangush or Manhush in Ukrainian, it was near an existing cemetery. There were new graves, but it was not a pit. And I tallied up now, I think the tally was between 300 and 400 new graves, nearly 100 of which were empty. So awaiting newly deceased. And the rest of them were mounds that had either the markings of the person, if it was known who was deceased, and their date of birth, and if not, they were numbered. And then, as I just mentioned, there were two grave diggers that showed up while I was there with a fellow journalist, Roman Kasarov. And these two grave diggers were frankly pissed off at the allegations of a mass grave. And they said, like, no, we work here. We know who's buried here. We buried people individually in coffins, including Ukrainian soldiers. And, even I have to say, people just want to believe this narrative so much that even after showing that, and even Roman is with RT, and he had two cameramen, one of whom had a drone. to take aerial footage and show that, the site that we're showing from the ground perspective does correspond to the murky satellite images. Even after that, people are still like, oh, well, you weren't at the right site, or, oh, well, those mounds were buried over the actual mass grave, disregarding the fact that we had 2 witnesses who work in the graveyard and stated very definitively there's no mass grave, and instead clinging on to the words of a runaway mayor who's nowhere to be seen and just spouting nonsense, So that's one hoax I can personally kind of have said, have some role, or I've at least witnessed, and can debunk in that regard. But the rest of it, I have to say, I've seen online, but it's been ridiculous. You have people making claims of Ukrainian forces shooting down Russian planes, and it turns out it's based on a video game.
It goes to Kiev.
Yeah, exactly. This Valiant goes to Kiev. And I wasn't even aware of it at the time, because I guess I must have been, I don't know when it came out, but maybe I was in the Donbass at the time, but I wasn't even aware of that garbage. And then when I looked into it and then saw afterwards that it was based on a video game, it's just laughable. You have
Day 2, Eva. Day 2 that I saw that stuff out there.
It's day 2. Okay.
Right out of the gate, they started. I think they went for a certain demographic and they got them for a little bit, but then, they had to admit it was bullshit, and then they try to bring it back, and people keep trying to revive this Ghost of Kiev story, and it is just a video game. It's pretty phony.
Well, you have Mr. 4-star General McCaffrey, I think his name is, also tweeting some other video game footage and claiming similarly Ukrainian victory. But I think another one that's very timely right now is this constant claim by by the Ukrainian government and Western media and Western representatives that Russia is causing a famine by preventing Ukraine from exporting grains. Well, that's complete nonsense, because the Russian authorities have made very clear, I think it's the port of Odessa, right, that is mined by the Ukrainian forces. The Russian government has made very clear, like, number one, it's mined by Ukraine. And number two, Russia is willing to help demine. And also Russia is willing to give safe passage through other ports, so this is not a question of Russia preventing Ukraine from exporting its precious wheat and grains, but this is how it's being depicted in Western media. And on top of that, by the way, there was some other report about, I think, a shipment of, I'm not sure what it was. It wasn't grain. It was some other cargo leaving Mariupol. And this is being depicted by Western media as Russia looting Ukraine. Now, let's just pause and recall that America has been actively looting Syria of its wheat and its oil for years and years and years. And we do not see Western media speaking about actual looting.
Yeah. And it's crazy because the EU has kind of had the same kind of mentality, the way that the United States always blames Putin for the oil. It's Putin's price hike. Now you hear the EU talking about the famish issue and whatnot, having ties to Jordan and whatnot. I believe you retweeted this. I saw this the other day. But this is something that can have some really serious long-term effects. It's not just about looting, it's about destroying. And wouldn't that have just a longer effect than if we were just stealing items? They're actually destroying the infrastructure, especially when it comes to the breadbasket of the world, when it comes to Ukraine.
Yeah. Now, when you're talking about something I retweeted, you mean with regards to Ukraine or Syria?
You were talking about Ukraine. Let me pull it up here. I think it was the EU blaming, and you were talking about the mining of the ports.
Yeah.
And it should be blamed on Kiev. Excuse me, I shouldn't say Kiev. Kiev. I'm talking.
See, that's the Western media
language. Yeah. Yeah, but no, here it is. And you were talking about it. That's why it was fresh off my mind. You just kind of jumped into it. The fact is that they're destroying a lot of the food supply inside Ukraine. It's they're self-destructing on purpose. It's really, really some really dark entities that are at work here in Ukraine.
Mm.
Yeah, I definitely think there's an element to that as well. And also the other thing is that the constant, Russia is losing this conflict, Ukraine is winning. Based on your experience and what you've seen, and also, of course, that of other journalists on Telegram that I know have been the salvation to contradict these mainstream views. Is Ukraine done in terms of quote unquote winning this conflict?
It is, and the West continuing to prolong it is just prolonging misery and loss of life when it does occur. And I think even I think there's a point when Ukraine was actually willing to come to the table. I might be wrong about that, but certainly by this point, and this is again referring to a video I was listening, Brian Berlatuk was making this point, like Ukraine could have come to the table. Well, Ukraine could have, first of all, like not committed the war, frankly, the genocide against the people of Donbass since 2014. Ukraine could have come to the table when President Putin made his speech and made that final offer before the military operation began to, have more conversation. Ukraine could have come to the table over the 8 years it's been waging war, and it still could. And each day that the West, sends more weapons and promotes more talk of war is another day that it's just prolonging something that is futile at this point. If they think that Russia is going to just stop its military operation, they're wrong. I think I'm not a military analyst, but I think what is being misconstrued in Western media is they have been claiming, Russia wanted to take Kiev or it wanted to take other cities and it failed because, like you just said, they're trying to portray Russia as failing. But that was not Russia's objective. Russia's objective, from my understanding, has been so far to liberate these areas of the Donbass, restore security, stop Ukraine's war in the Donbass. And after that, I can't say, but the fact that it has not taken Kiev or other cities is not an indication of failure on Russia's part. It's an indication of propaganda or at best a gross misunderstanding on the West part.
But don't you think that there could be, and I'm just asking your opinion because you were able to get on the ground, that might be a mistake in itself to kind of hold back and only try to protect those areas, since there's a lot of shelling going from the Ukrainian, proper Ukrainian now, as we should say, area. Because I mean, if it's not going to stop and they're going to get arms and arms and arms until eventually this government is removed, until the Zelensky government is removed, how can we be assured that the war will never stop, or at least the firing from the militias that's left of the Ukrainian army?
I can't really answer that. I think I was looking at a map earlier today. If I remember, it was saying, trying to remember which channel it was, but anyway, I think it was saying there was basically one supply route left. I might be wrong about that. But I think, like I was saying earlier, Ukrainian forces are so well entrenched because they've had 8 years to do
Exactly.
so around the Donbass. And they at that close proximity, they can do a lot of damage to the people of Donbass. So I see why that would be Russia's priority at this moment. I think most of the damage, from what I can see, is coming from those forces the closest to the Donbass and not from further afoot.
Yeah.
But this one question is just one of the last ones I'm going to ask, but I just wanted to touch on this because a lot of the discussion has been around, is Russia an actual adversarial power to this NATO globalist agenda that we're seeing? We're looking at the Bilderberg group meeting that nobody's talking about except a few of us. And it's just so obvious that there's something there. You had, the highest echelons of secret society meeting. You had Ukrainian politicians. Zelensky is allegedly made an appearance via Zoom. So what do you, the question is, do you see Russia as an actual adversarial power to this agenda based on your reporting, based on your knowledge?
That's a hard question. There's so much speculation about that. And I have to say, my feeling is based on intuition. And I can't give you like solid arguments to back my feeling that Russia is against the agenda. Why did I choose to move to Russia? Because I felt intuitively that it wasn't a part of this globalist agenda. Sure, yes, we see things that certain analysts or certain writers can attribute to Russia being a part of it. Mm-hmm. But I think that we just don't have all of the factors, and we never will have all the factors. And at the end of the day, we can speculate as much as we want, but we don't really know what's going on. And the other thing I've seen people that want to definitively say Russia's a part of it, they'll say, well, Putin met with so-and-so. Well, he's a diplomat, he does meet with people. It doesn't mean necessarily an endorsement. And even if you see Russia going along with certain policies that have to do with, the COVID agenda, I've come to believe that we can't decide based on that because we don't know all the factors. We don't know what's the reasoning behind. For example, in 2020, I was in Syria for 6 months, and Syria went along with certain policies, and then they dropped the policies. They nominally had some policies, and my line of thought at that time was, well, for Syria, it was a different equation. Syria was a rock and a hard place. It had almost the entire world against it. If it didn't go along with certain policies, then that gives more fodder to the people that want to accuse the government of not taking care of its people, et cetera, et cetera. With Russia, I know it's a different situation. I can't explain why there have been elements of Russia going along with certain, for example, COVID policies. But back to my intuitive feeling, it doesn't make sense that Russia, which has frankly fought off the perversions of the West and continues to do so, would be going along with this project, which I do believe exists, that would see all of Russia's, culture and borders disappear or disseminate. Like it rationally doesn't make sense to me. I feel like I'm not going to say I'm not going to speak about like grand chessboard or any of that stuff. I just feel like intuitively we will see that Russia is not a part of this, but I sit to be corrected. That's pretty much as the most I can say. I just don't feel like it. I think Russia has such a rich culture and history, and also stands to benefit from a multipolar world. Whereas that's not what this globalist agenda wants. And we're seeing more and more alliances with other nations that have been oppressed or whatever by America's unilateral stance. So I don't know, we'll see. But I mean, what about you? What's your take on this?
I mean, I see that the United States is allowing Venezuela to ship oil to Europe. And so that to me just shows a sign of weakness. Despite the perception they're trying to build that, they still hold this unilateral power in the world. What we're seeing is the building of relationships between China, between Russia, Iran, and also the global South, both in Africa and of course, South America and Latin America are rebelling against this globalist agenda. President of Mexico, AMLO, just decided he decided a few days ago that he wasn't going to go to the Democracy Summit of the Americas. And in spite of the United States State Department trying to convince him otherwise. And so I think what you're seeing is a marked shift to this multipolar world. How that's going to look like is up in the air. We don't really know the forces involved. And I think it's more than nation states. I think it's actual, sectors of power that I think are going into this. But I 100% agree with you. I think Russia is a very ethnically rich and Eastern nation that has suffered a lot because of U.S. hegemony and NATO. So I really have a hard time thinking that they're just going to follow along with this global agenda. And Pasta, I don't know if you disagree with that or not, because I know you were kind of iffy before.
I'm still iffy. I mean, I have the same questions as Eva too, as well, when you talk about the COVID stuff. But, I heard some type of possibilities when people were talking about what was going on with China, in Shanghai, was it a shakedown? Because there was obviously ties to the West in Shanghai. And did China go in there acting like they were using this whole COVID situation to kind of weed people out? Where they came to the COVID situation, did Putin and the Russian Federation just shoot everybody up with placebos to act like they were going along to get along? I don't know. You know what I'm saying? I certainly have questions all over the place. I can tell you this much from seeing the Western media freak out the way they are and seeing Putin kind of like tie commodities completely to the ruble. It definitely does seem like a shun in the Western's face. And I'm just looking more at like China and India, what's going on. I have more questions with China. It always seems like they have more financial ties when it comes to the COVID situation and whatnot. But I don't know. I don't know if it's all theater. I don't know what to think. But if I had to roll the dice and put, take my chances. It's like I'm thinking about, maybe moving to Russia myself one day, to be honest with you, from seeing what's going on in the West. But, I don't know. That is the question. And I think a lot of people are continuing to ask these questions. And that's why we have to continue to get people like yourself on who've been in that region, who understand what's going on a little bit more clearly than what the mainstream media is telling us all here back at home.
Well, thank you, Eva, for coming on and having this conversation. We really appreciate it. I know you have a great Telegram channel. Would you let everybody know what that is and wherever we can find your work?
Oh yeah, it's well, I called it reality theories because as you know, we're all called conspiracy theorists, and I decided to flip that.
Great name.
So yeah, it's reality theories. I'll send you the link. And I'm more active there than on Twitter or Facebook for obvious reasons. So yeah, appreciate you plugging that. And I will hopefully be back in the Donbass in the near future. So whatever I can post, internet allowing, I will be posting there.
Yeah.
Thanks, Eva. We really appreciate your work and really taking risks to do the work you do, and all of the other journalists that put their life on the line. Thank you for recommending them, because I'm sure people may not know them. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you very much for having me on.
Eva, make sure you come back on the morning show. You can come really early so you don't have to stay up extra late over there. We understand the time difference, so we really do appreciate you staying up a little extra here to come on the Convo Couch. Thank you so much.
Thanks.